October 1944. The meeting rooms of the Allied High Command in France were filled with cigarette smoke and thick with anxiety. General George S. Patton, known to everyone as Old Blood and Guts, stood over a map that was delivering news he didn't want to accept. Time was slipping away from him. Even worse, his armored strength was disappearing. His tanks were running out. Across the Atlantic, and now idling in the muddy staging areas of England and France, was a powerful reserve the U.S. Army had been reluctant to unleash. They were capable, motivated, and trained on the same M4 Sherman tanks as every other armored unit in the field. Yet one factor set them apart, a factor that terrified politicians in Washington and unsettled senior commanders at the front. These soldiers were black. This is the story of the 751st Tank Battalion. History would come to know them as the Black Panthers. But long before German forces learned to fear that name, the American military itself had to confront its own anxiety about letting them fight. At that time, the U.S. Army was rigidly segregated, divided strictly along racial lines. A deeply rooted belief, repeated so often that even high-ranking officers accepted it as truth, claimed that black soldiers lacked the intelligence required for mechanized warfare and the courage needed for frontline combat. They were expected to drive supply trucks, prepare meals, or bury the dead. They were not expected to destroy Nazi forces from inside the turret of a 30-ton armored vehicle. Patton, however, was a realist above all else. He surveyed his exhausted, understrength divisions. Then he turned his attention to the fresh but untested battalion of black tankers waiting on the sidelines. He understood the danger, not so much from enemy fire, but from public reaction. Sending black soldiers to perform what society considered a white man's role was, at that time, political suicide. But the Germans weren't waiting for American politics to resolve themselves. Enemy defenses were hardening, winter was approaching fast, and Patton needed men who could kill. He made his decision. Yet he didn't simply issue an order, he went to meet them himself. He stood before them, looked them straight in the eye. What followed was more than a deployment, it was a test. A demand to prove an entire nation wrong while confronting the most lethal army the world had ever seen. Patton hesitated to send them, perhaps not because he doubted they would succeed, but because somewhere inside he may have feared they would excel. And if they did, if they proved themselves beyond question, how could America continue to deny them full citizenship? The 751st was about to be thrown into the grinder of war. They were on the verge of becoming one of the most aggressive and effective armored units in the European theater. Yet their first battle was not against the Wehrmacht, it was against the skepticism of the country whose flag they wore. Before understanding the brutal efficiency the Black Panthers would later demonstrate in Germany, you have to return to the place where they were shaped. That place was Camp Hood, Texas, defined by mud, heat, and open hostility. For 2 long years, the men of the 751st prepared for a war they weren't even sure they'd be allowed to fight. While white tank units completed training and shipped overseas within months, the Black Panthers were kept behind. They drilled relentlessly, repeating the same exercises until they could operate their Shermans instinctively, without thought. They didn't just learn how to drive tanks, they mastered them, pushing the machines to their limits. But their struggle wasn't against Hitler at first. It began at the bus stop outside the base. This truth is uncomfortable, but it cannot be ignored. In Texas, in 1943, a captured German soldier, someone who had pledged loyalty to the Nazi Party, could walk into a diner and be served a meal. The black American soldier guarding him, however, was forced to remain outside, eating from the back entrance. The men of the 751st witnessed scenes like this every day. They absorbed the insults, they restrained their anger, and they poured all of that resentment into their training. Their officers, aware of the constant scrutiny hanging over them, pushed the unit harder than any other. They understood the reality. If a white soldier made a mistake, it was simply human error. If a black soldier made the same mistake, it would be cited as evidence that his entire race was unfit for combat. Perfection became their armor. By the time they finally landed in France in October 1944, they were no longer just troops. They were compressed energy, tightened by years of delay, humiliation, and restraint. Then the moment they'd heard whispered rumors about finally arrived. General Patton appeared. There was no friendly greeting. He came scowling, his sharp, high voice slicing through the cold autumn air. He climbed onto a half-track, surveying the rows of black faces before him. These men had endured slurs. They had felt the contempt of civilians back home. They expected to be warned to stay in the background. Instead, Patton met their gaze and gave them a mission. He told them, "Men, you are the first Negro tankers ever to fight in the American Army. I would not have asked for you if you weren't capable."
"I don't have anything in my army except the best," he told them. "I don't care what color you are as long as you go up there and kill those crouching sons of bitches." He warned them that every eye was on them, that expectations were high. But he also made one thing brutally clear. The enemy was relentless, and mercy would not be shown. For the first time, a senior white commander addressed them not as laborers or auxiliaries, but as combat soldiers. Patton didn't promise equality or civil rights. He offered them something far more immediate: permission to fight and destroy the enemy. For the men of the 761st, that was enough. The general climbed down. Sherman engines thundered to life, belching black smoke into the French sky. Training had ended. The waiting was over. The battalion rolled toward the town of Morville-les-Vicq. As steel tracks chewed into the mud, none of them truly understood what happened when armor met steel. They were about to learn that bravery alone was not enough, that survival demanded something more. It was November 1944 in the Lorraine region of France. If hell had a lower level, it would have looked like this. The ground was no longer solid earth, but a frozen slurry that swallowed boots and trapped 30-ton tanks. The soldiers called it General Mud, and it fought them almost as fiercely as the Germans did. Texas heat was a distant memory. Now they were soaked, shaking with cold, staring into a gray fog that concealed the deadliest anti-tank weapons ever built. This was their baptism by fire. Training manuals explained procedures and tactics, but they never described the sound of a German 88mm shell ripping through the air, a noise like massive fabric tearing apart, followed by an explosion that slammed your teeth together inside your skull. When combat finally came, the truth of armored warfare revealed itself instantly. A Sherman was a formidable machine, but against a Tiger, a Panther, or a hidden anti-tank gun, it was often little more than a target. A single accurate hit could turn the tank into a furnace. Every man inside knew that. They waited inside steel hulls packed with fuel and ammunition, fully aware that any shadow in the tree line could be their last sight. Panic never took hold. Discipline did. In the chaos of those first heavy engagements near Morville-les-Vicq, men were separated from boys, and above the noise, one name began to stand out: Staff Sergeant Reuben Rivers. Rivers was a quiet man from Oklahoma, not given to speeches or theatrics. He led through action. As shells slammed down and radio traffic turned frantic, his voice stayed steady. He didn't steer away from danger. He drove straight towards it. The Germans controlled the high ground, dug in and confident that this inexperienced American unit would collapse under fire. They expected the black troops Nazi propaganda mocked as inferior to break and flee. Instead, the guns of the 761st lowered and surged forward. They attacked with an intensity that stunned the defenders. Roadblocks were smashed aside. Infantry positions pinning down American forces were obliterated. They weren't simply operating tanks anymore. They were stalking their prey. When the smoke finally lifted over Morville-les-Vic, the town was secured. The objective was taken. They had faced death head-on and refused to flinch. White infantrymen they supported, men who might not have shared a drink with them weeks earlier, now looked at the black tankers with something new in their eyes: relief. But victories in war always come at a price. They had proven they could fight. They had proven they could win. As the adrenaline faded, letters of condolence began traveling home to grieving families. And beneath the celebration of that first success, something darker began to form within the battalion. They understood now that competence alone wouldn't keep them alive. What lay ahead would require ruthlessness. One man in particular was about to show the Germans what true terror looked like. As the battalion pushed deeper into enemy territory, the war reshaped them. Hesitation vanished. In its place grew a cold, unyielding resolve. They stopped caring about the Army's judgment and focused solely on annihilating whatever stood in their path. Nowhere was this transformation clearer or more frightening than in the actions of Sergeant Warren G. H. Cressy. Before the war, Cressy had been quiet and unassuming. On the battlefield, something inside him broke free. It happened on an overcast November day while his tank led in advance. Without warning, the world detonated around him. A German anti-tank round smashed into his Sherman, disabling it instantly. Most men who survived such a hit would crawl for cover and thank God they were alive. Cressy did not. He burst from the burning wreck, uniform smoking, eyes scanning the battlefield. He saw German infantry advancing, confident they had halted the American assault. Cressy did not retreat. He spotted a nearby jeep armed with a .30 caliber machine gun and leapt onto its exposed rear, completely vulnerable to enemy fire. Bullets tore up the dirt around him as he grabbed the trigger and didn't just shoot. He unleashed fury. German soldiers fell as he tore through their ranks. He swung the weapon toward artillery observers concealed in the distance and cut them down. Witnesses later said he fought like a man overtaken by something beyond fear. Machine gun nests were erased. Anti-tank crews were wiped out. Alone, he held the line while the rest of his unit regrouped. By the time the barrels smoked empty, the German counterattack had collapsed. His fellow soldiers stared at him with equal parts admiration and unease. They began to call him the most dangerous man in the 761st.
They were witnessing a fighter whose ruthless intensity was something even Patton himself might have admired. Yet while Cressy was carving a path of destruction, another hero was engaged in a far quieter and far more painful struggle, one that would demand everything he had. Staff Sergeant Reuben Rivers was exhausted. Not ordinary fatigue, but the kind that seeps into your bones and never truly fades. It was the middle of November, and the 761st was advancing toward the town of Gebling. The Germans were determined to hold it and had heavily mined the roads leading in. Rivers was once again in the lead tank. He always was. He refused to fight from anywhere else. Without warning, a deafening crack shattered the afternoon. Rivers' tank had rolled over a mine. The blast tore through the underside of the hull, hurling him violently inside the steel compartment. When he looked down, his leg was destroyed, ripped open down to the bone. The pain was overwhelming, the kind that could drop even the strongest man unconscious. Medics rushed forward and took one look before delivering the verdict. His war was over. They prepared him for evacuation. His commanding officer, Captain David Williams, came to his side and gave him a clear order. "Reuben, you've done enough. Go back. Go home. You're getting the Silver Star, but you have to leave." Rivers met his captain's eyes. He glanced down at his shattered leg, throbbing with agony, then looked toward the German lines where enemy guns flashed in the distance. He pushed the morphine away. "Captain," he said, his voice rough but steady, "I see them. We'll take them." He refused the stretcher. He refused the order. With a leg that barely functioned, Reuben Rivers climbed into another tank and assumed command. For the next 3 days, he led the assault on Gebling. He fought through infection creeping into his bloodstream. He fought through fever. He fought because he knew that without his experience, the younger men under him might never make it home. He was running purely on willpower, holding death back with one hand while steering a tank with the other. But even the strongest resolve has limits. By the morning of November 19th, the situation had become desperate. German forces were counterattacking with heavy armor. Rivers was fading. His skin had turned ashen. His eyes were hollow from pain and sleeplessness. Yet he remained on the radio, directing movements, placing tanks where they could strike hardest. Captain Williams begged him one final time over the radio to pull back. It was an order. Rivers' voice came back through the static, calm as ever. "Almost there, Captain. Just a little farther." Those were among the last words he ever spoke. A German shell found his tank. The hit was direct. The radio fell silent. For a brief moment, it felt as if the heart of the 761st had stopped beating. Staff Sergeant Reuben Rivers was dead. What followed was not a withdrawal, it was slaughter. When the news spread over the radios, something inside the battalion snapped. Grief did not weaken them, it sharpened them. There were no tears. Armor-piercing rounds were loaded instead. The 761st advanced with a cold, methodical precision. They slammed into the German lines with a fury that was deeply personal. They hunted down the tanks responsible for killing their sergeant and crushed all resistance in the area, driving the enemy back with a violence that stunned even seasoned commanders. They were no longer fighting for territory alone. They were fighting for Reuben. They cleared the sector, leaving burning German wrecks behind them. There was no pause, no chance to properly mourn the man they had lost, because far to the north, in the frozen forests of Belgium, Adolf Hitler was preparing one final desperate gamble, and the 761st was about to be pulled into the most famous battle of the war. December 1944, the Battle of the Bulge. Hitler had secretly concentrated his remaining panzer divisions for a surprise offensive through the Ardennes. His aim was to split the Allied armies in half. American defenses buckled, confusion spread. Thousands of U.S. soldiers were encircled. General Patton, fighting in the south, received an order that seemed impossible. Pivot the entire Third Army 90 degrees to the north, march through a blizzard, and strike the German flank to relieve the town of Bastogne. It was a logistical nightmare, and Patton needed his fastest, hardest-hitting units at the front. He called for the Black Panthers. The 761st broke off from the line and drove straight into the worst winter Europe had seen in decades. Temperatures plunged to zero, roads turned into slick sheets of ice. Tank armor became so cold that bare skin would tear away on contact. They drove non-stop, engines groaning, tracks sliding across frozen roads. They weren't fighting Germans yet, they were fighting the weather, and they endured. When they reached the outskirts of Bastogne, the situation was desperate. The 101st Airborne, the Screaming Eagles, were surrounded, low on ammunition, freezing and barely holding their positions. Then, through the blowing snow, engines thundered. The Black Panthers slammed into the German flank near the town of Tillet. The fighting was brutal. Snow turned black with soot and red with blood. Elite SS Panzer divisions stood in their way, the best Germany had left. They had not expected American armor this fast, this aggressive, this relentless, striking their flank. The irony was impossible to ignore. Inside the perimeter at Bastogne were young white American soldiers, many from the Deep South, praying for relief. The answer to those prayers arrived in the form of black men and Sherman tanks smashing a corridor through the Nazi encirclement. The 761st severed the primary supply route the Germans were using to choke Bastogne. They shattered the German offensive in their sector. When the long-awaited link-up finally occurred, there were no slurs, no separation, no lines drawn by race. There was only the bond of men who had endured hell together. And as the 761st turned their gaze eastward, past wrecked German armor and snow-covered fields, they saw something else. They were looking at Germany itself. The Siegfried Line, Dragon's Teeth, a fortress designed to be unbreakable. Patton wanted to press forward, and the Black Panthers were ready to knock on Hitler's door. By the spring of 1945, the end of the so-called Thousand-Year Reich was within sight, but the path was still sealed. Blocking the Allied advance stood the Siegfried Line, an engineering nightmare. Endless rows of concrete tank traps known as Dragon's Teeth, bunkers with walls 6 feet thick, artillery pre-registered on every approach. It was meant to halt entire armies. What the Germans hadn't accounted for was the 761st. By now, the battalion's reputation was firmly established. They were a shock force. When other units stalled, the call went out for the Black Panthers. Task Force R was formed, with the 761st at its tip. They didn't creep toward the Dragon's Teeth, they attacked them at speed. They blew gaps through concrete barriers, they drowned pillboxes in fire until every gun fell silent. There was a deep, almost poetic justice in what followed. Nazi ideology rested on the myth of a master race, the belief that the Aryan man stood above all others, especially black men. Yet here were the descendants of enslaved people driving American steel across sacred German soil, smashing the Wehrmacht's strongest defenses. They tore through the Siegfried Line in a matter of days, advancing so rapidly they often outran their own maps. Town after town fell. Thousands of German soldiers surrendered. The expressions on their faces were a mix of shock and disbelief. They had been told these men couldn't fight. Now they were surrendering to them by the truckload. The 761st was ripping the heart out of the Nazi war machine. But as they crossed into Austria, pursuing the shattered remnants of the SS, they were about to learn that the enemy's evil went far beyond combat. The soldiers believed they had already seen every horror war could offer. They were wrong. Nothing, absolutely nothing, prepared them for what waited in the woods near Lambach. It began with the smell. Long before fences or guard towers came into view, a stench drifted on the wind that made seasoned tankers gag. It was the smell of death, industrial, suffocating. On May 4, 1945, the 761st rolled up to the gates of Gunskirchen Lager, a subcamp of the Mauthausen concentration camp system. The German guards had fled, abandoning thousands of Jewish prisoners. When the Black Panthers climbed down from their tanks, what they saw defied comprehension. Human skeletons staggered toward them, men and women reduced to skin and bone, eyes hollow, bodies covered in sores and filth. Corpses were stacked against the barracks like cordwood. By then, the men of the 761st were hardened fighters. They had watched friends die violently. They had killed at close range, but this shattered them. Battle-scarred sergeants broke down and cried openly. They emptied their pockets, handing out rations, chocolate, cigarettes, anything they could offer to ease the suffering. There was a deeper, almost unspoken connection in that moment of liberation. As black soldiers looked into the eyes of Jewish survivors, they recognized a hatred they understood all too well. They knew what it meant to be stripped of humanity. They understood what happens when a society decides that certain lives have no value.
One veteran later said, "That's when I knew what we were really fighting for. Not just land, but the idea that no human being is worth less than another." They had crushed the Wehrmacht. They had freed the condemned. The war in Europe was effectively finished. The Black Panthers had done everything their nation demanded, and far more than anyone had expected. Then it was time to return home. But the country they had fought for remained unchanged, even if they themselves were transformed. Their ships arrived in New York Harbor. The guns were silent. Uniforms were crisp. Yet there was no parade. No newsreels celebrated the men who broke the Siegfried Line or saved the 101st Airborne at Bastogne. When they stepped ashore, segregation was waiting for them exactly where they had left it. They came back to an America where they still couldn't sit at the front of a bus. Some were beaten, some were killed for daring to wear their uniform in public. The fiercest armored warriors in Europe were expected to fade back into obscurity. So they did what they could. They went home, raised families, and kept their stories alive quietly, in living rooms, in VFW halls. They waited. It took 33 years for recognition to arrive. In 1978, President Jimmy Carter finally corrected the injustice. The 761st Tank Battalion was awarded the Presidential Unit Citation, the highest honor given to a unit. The citation read like a war epic, detailing their courage, speed, and unbreakable determination. And Reuben Rivers, the man who fought on with his leg torn to the bone, who refused to abandon his men, had not been forgotten. His record gathered dust for decades, but those who remembered him would not let his name disappear. In 1997, 53 years after his death in a French field, Staff Sergeant Reuben Rivers was awarded the Medal of Honor. The story of the Black Panthers is more than a combat history. It is proof of the resilience of the human spirit. Patton feared sending them because he doubted them. In the end, it was they who had every reason to doubt him. They fought for a nation that did not love them. They saved a world that sought to erase them. They were the Black Panthers. They came out fighting, and history will never forget them again.